April 22nd, 1945. The concrete walls of the Führerbunker trembled as Soviet artillery shells exploded somewhere above in the ruined streets of Berlin. 60 feet below ground, in a cramped conference room thick with cigarette smoke and the stench of fear, Adolf Hitler sat hunched over maps that no longer corresponded to reality. Around him, his remaining generals shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their uniforms still crisp, but their faces hollow with exhaustion and dread. For 3 hours, they had been receiving reports from the collapsing front lines. Each message was worse than the last. And then came the report that would finally shatter the last vestige of Hitler's delusion about German victory. General Hans Krebs stood before the man who had once commanded the most powerful military force in Europe and delivered the words that would end an empire. The defense at Eberswalde had collapsed completely. Soviet tanks were pouring through the gap unopposed. There was no German reserve. There was no counterattack. There was nothing left to stop the Red Army from reaching the heart of Berlin within hours. Hitler looked up from his maps, his hands shaking uncontrollably, his left arm hanging limp at his side. For the first time since the war began, the words that came from his mouth contained no bluster, no rage, no impossible demands for miraculous victory. Instead, he spoke with the quiet certainty of a man who had finally glimpsed the mathematical reality of his situation. The war was lost. Suicide was his only option. In that moment, the Third Reich died not with explosions or gunfire, but with the simple admission of defeat from the man who had promised it would last 1,000 years. But how had it come to this? How had the dictator who had conquered most of Europe, who had commanded millions of soldiers, who had bent entire nations to his will, found himself trapped in an underground tomb, admitting that everything was over? The answer lies in the catastrophic final weeks of April 1945, when reality finally overwhelmed even Hitler's capacity for self-deception. To understand the magnitude of Hitler's April 22nd admission, we need to grasp what had been happening above ground while he cowered in his bunker. The Soviet offensive that began on April 16th wasn't just another military operation. It was the largest concentrated assault in human history, designed to obliterate what remained of Nazi Germany in a matter of days rather than weeks. The numbers were staggering. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers had assembled on the approaches to Berlin. They brought with them 6,250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, and over 41,000 artillery pieces. The artillery concentration was so dense that the Soviets had positioned 250 guns for every kilometre of front line. When this massive force opened fire simultaneously on April 16th, the bombardment was visible from space and audible from hundreds of miles away. Facing this overwhelming assault was what remained of German Army Group Vistula, a formation that existed more on paper than in reality. The Germans could muster perhaps 200,000 men, most of them teenagers or elderly volunteers with minimal training. They had 750 tanks and assault guns, many broken down or out of fuel. Their artillery numbered fewer than 1,500 pieces, scattered across a front that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The mathematical impossibility of German victory was obvious to anyone capable of basic arithmetic. The Soviets outnumbered the Germans 12-1 in soldiers, 8-1 in tanks, and 27-1 in artillery. But mathematics had never deterred Hitler before. Throughout the war, he had consistently ignored logistical reality, believing that willpower and ideological determination could overcome material disadvantages. At Stalingrad, he had insisted that the Sixth Army could hold out indefinitely despite being surrounded and starving. At Kursk, he had launched massive tank offensives against prepared Soviet defences, because he believed German superiority would prevail. In Normandy, he had refused to release panzer reserves because he was convinced the Allied landing was a deception. Each time, reality had eventually asserted itself through catastrophic defeat, but Hitler had always found ways to rationalize these failures. Stalingrad was lost because of treacherous generals. Kursk failed due to inadequate supplies. Normandy succeeded because of spy networks and superior enemy numbers. There was always someone else to blame, always some external factor that explained why German arms had not achieved their destined victory. April 1945 was different. The Soviet offensive shattered German defenses so completely and so rapidly that rationalization became impossible. On the first day of the assault, Soviet forces crossed the Oder River and began their attack on the Silo Heights, the last major defensive position protecting Berlin from the east. German commanders had spent months preparing these positions, building concrete bunkers, laying minefields, and positioning their best remaining troops. If the Wehrmacht was going to make a stand anywhere, it would be here. The Silo Heights fell in 4 days. Not 4 weeks or 4 months, but 4 days. By April 19th, German forces were in full retreat, abandoning positions that were supposed to hold out indefinitely. Soviet tanks were rolling through gaps in the defensive lines so large that entire armoured divisions could advance side by side without encountering resistance. The speed of this collapse was psychologically devastating for Hitler because it demonstrated that German military effectiveness had deteriorated beyond any possibility of recovery. These weren't raw recruits being overwhelmed by superior numbers. These were the remnants of divisions that had fought across Europe, commanded by experienced officers who understood defensive warfare. If they couldn't hold prepared positions against Soviet attack, then no German force anywhere could resist the Red Army. But the Eastern Front wasn't the only source of catastrophic news reaching Hitler's bunker. On April 18th, an entire German army group surrendered in the Ruhr pocket. 325,000 soldiers, including dozens of generals and thousands of officers, simply laid down their weapons and marched into American captivity. This wasn't a tactical withdrawal or a temporary setback. It was the complete elimination of Army Group B, one of Germany's largest remaining formations. The psychological impact of this mass surrender was particularly acute because it occurred on the Western Front, where German propaganda had insisted that soldiers would fight more effectively against American and British forces than against the Soviets. The surrender proved that German military morale had collapsed across all fronts simultaneously. Meanwhile, American forces had crossed the Elbe River and were advancing toward Berlin from the west. By April 11th, Allied troops were within 100 kilometers of the German capital, close enough that their artillery could theoretically shell the city's outer suburbs. The strategic situation had become hopeless from every direction simultaneously. Hitler's physical condition during these final weeks provided a shocking illustration of how completely the stress of defeat had broken him. Witnesses described a man who bore little resemblance to the commanding figure who had dominated European politics for over a decade. His left hand shook uncontrollably, due to what was likely Parkinson's disease. His right leg dragged behind him as he walked, forcing him to use a shuffling gait that made him appear decades older than his 56 years. The man who had once mesmerized audiences with hours-long speeches now struggled to complete sentences without losing his train of thought. His famous penetrating stare remained, but it was now set in a face that had become gaunt and pale from months of living underground. Those who had known him before the war reported that shaking hands with Hitler had become an unsettling experience because his grip was weak and his palm was constantly damp with perspiration. This physical deterioration reflected the psychological collapse that was occurring beneath the surface. Hitler had built his entire identity around the concept of German racial superiority and his own role as the destined leader who would create a 1,000-year empire. Every aspect of his worldview was predicated on the assumption that Germanic peoples were inherently superior to all others, and that this superiority would inevitably manifest itself through military victory. April 1945 was systematically destroying every pillar of this belief system. German soldiers were surrendering en masse to supposedly inferior Slavic troops. German cities were being occupied by armies Hitler had declared racially incapable of advanced military organization. The master race was being systematically defeated by peoples Nazi ideology had classified as subhuman. The cognitive dissonance created by this reality was unbearable for a man who had never learned to accept personal responsibility for failure. Throughout his political career, Hitler had demonstrated a pathological inability to acknowledge mistakes or admit that his strategies might be flawed. When the German economy struggled in the early 1930s, he blamed international Jewish conspiracies. When military campaigns faced setbacks, he dismissed generals and replaced them with more compliant officers. When bombing campaigns devastated German cities, he promised miracle weapons that would reverse the situation. But by April 1945, the miracle weapons had proven to be fantasies. The V-2 rockets that were supposed to terrorize London into submission had accomplished nothing beyond wasting scarce resources. The jet aircraft that were going to sweep Allied bombers from German skies existed only in prototype form. The atomic bomb program that was supposed to give Germany decisive technological advantage had been abandoned due to lack of materials and scientific personnel. Even more crushing than the military situation was the realization that the German people themselves were abandoning the Nazi cause. Throughout the war, Hitler had maintained his psychological equilibrium by believing that ordinary Germans shared his fanatical commitment to total victory or total destruction. He had convinced himself that the Volk would fight to the last man rather than accept defeat, that German cities would become fortresses where every citizen would die defending their homes. The reality was devastatingly different. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, they encountered not fanatical resistance, but widespread surrender and collaboration. German civilians hung white flags from their windows and greeted occupying troops with relief rather than defiance. Local officials handed over administrative control without protest. Even SS units, the supposed guardians of Nazi ideology, were surrendering or simply disappearing rather than fighting to the death. This collapse of popular support was perhaps more psychologically damaging to Hitler than the military defeats, because it challenged his fundamental conception of his relationship with the German people. He had always portrayed himself as the embodiment of German will, the leader who expressed what every true German felt in their hearts. If Germans were welcoming defeat rather than choosing destruction, then either his understanding of the German character was completely wrong, or he had never truly represented German interests at all. Intelligence reports reaching the bunker painted an increasingly grim picture of conditions throughout what remained of the Reich. Food distribution had collapsed in most major cities. Transportation networks were so thoroughly destroyed that moving supplies or reinforcements was virtually impossible. Industrial production had fallen to perhaps 10% of wartime levels. The administrative apparatus that had once governed a continental empire was disintegrating into local fiefdoms where officials made whatever deals they could with approaching Allied forces. The symbolic importance of Berlin's bombardment on Hitler's birthday, April 20th, cannot be overstated. For over a decade, April 20th had been one of the most important dates on the Nazi calendar, marked by massive parades, ceremonial speeches, and demonstrations of German military might. The fact that enemy artillery was now exploding in the streets of the German capital on this sacred date represented the complete inversion of everything the Nazi movement had promised to achieve. Hitler spent his final birthday receiving reports that made clear how thoroughly his empire was collapsing. Soviet forces had begun their assault on Berlin's outer defenses. American troops were advancing rapidly from the west, with minimal resistance. The last functioning German airfields were being overrun, making air support impossible. Even the communication systems that allowed the bunker to maintain contact with military units were breaking down as telephone lines were severed and radio stations were captured. The psychological impact of these cascading disasters was compounded by Hitler's increasing isolation from reality. The bunker's cramped quarters and artificial lighting created an environment that distorted perception and judgment. Staff members reported that Hitler often seemed confused about what time of day it was, or how long meetings had been lasting. His famous ability to recall detailed military statistics and unit dispositions was deteriorating rapidly, forcing him to rely increasingly on advisors whose own information was often hours or days out of date. This isolation meant that when accurate reports did reach Hitler, they came as particularly devastating shocks. The news about Eberswalde wasn't just another military setback. It was the definitive proof that German forces were no longer capable of mounting any effective resistance. Eberswalde controlled the direct approach to Berlin from the northeast. Its fall meant that Soviet tanks could reach the government district within hours rather than days. The specific manner of Eberswalde's collapse was particularly damaging to Hitler's remaining psychological defences. German forces hadn't fought a desperate battle and been overwhelmed by superior numbers. They had simply abandoned their positions without offering significant resistance. This wasn't heroic defeat in the face of impossible odds. It was the practical surrender of troops who had decided the war was no longer worth fighting. When General Krebs delivered this report on April 22nd, he was essentially telling Hitler that the German military had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Individual units might still be holding scattered positions, but there was no longer any coordinated resistance, no strategic reserves, no possibility of mounting counterattacks or establishing new defensive lines. The Wehrmacht had dissolved not through catastrophic battle, but through the quiet decision of thousands of individual soldiers and officers that continued fighting was pointless. This realization triggered the emotional breakdown that witnesses described as unlike any of Hitler's previous rages. His earlier tantrums had been performances designed to intimidate subordinates or express frustration with specific setbacks. The April 22nd outburst was different because it contained the explicit acknowledgement that his entire life's work had been a failure. For the first time, Hitler wasn't blaming external factors or promising miraculous reversals. He was admitting that the war was lost and that suicide was his only remaining option. The specific mention of suicide was particularly significant because it represented Hitler's final abandonment of his messianic self-image. Throughout his career, he had portrayed himself as a figure of destiny who would either triumph completely or die gloriously in battle. The decision to commit suicide in an underground bunker rather than fighting to the death above ground demonstrated his recognition that there would be nothing glorious about his end. The psychological mechanics of this final breakdown reveal something profound about the nature of absolute power and its inevitable collision with reality. Hitler had spent years surrounding himself with subordinates who learned that contradicting him was career suicide, possibly literal suicide. The system he created rewarded those who told him what he wanted to hear while eliminating anyone who dared present uncomfortable truths. By April 1945, this carefully constructed bubble of delusion had become so complete that Hitler was making strategic decisions based on information that bore no resemblance to actual conditions. The irony was devastating. The man who had once demonstrated remarkable political instincts, who had outmaneuvered seasoned politicians and built a movement from nothing, had become completely divorced from the reality he claimed to control. His ability to read situations and manipulate outcomes, the skills that had brought him to power, had atrophied through years of refusing to acknowledge anything that contradicted his vision of inevitable victory. This willful blindness had created a feedback loop that accelerated Germany's collapse. Because Hitler punished bearers of bad news, his subordinates learned to soften reports, minimize problems, and present optimistic assessments that might avoid his wrath. Intelligence reports were sanitized before reaching him. Casualty figures were reduced. Enemy strength was underestimated. Supply shortages were downplayed. The cumulative effect was that Hitler's strategic decisions were based on increasingly fictional assessments of reality. By April 1945, the gap between Hitler's understanding and actual conditions had become so vast that no amount of psychological manipulation could bridge it. Soviet artillery shells exploding directly overhead couldn't be explained away through propaganda. The absence of German reinforcements couldn't be attributed to temporary communication problems. The sight of his own staff preparing for evacuation or suicide couldn't be dismissed as defeatist thinking. The physical environment of the bunker itself had become a metaphor for the collapsing Reich. The constant dampness from groundwater seepage created an atmosphere of decay that permeated everything. The artificial lighting and recycled air gave the complex an otherworldly quality that disconnected its inhabitants from the natural rhythms of day and night. The narrow corridors and cramped rooms forced close proximity between people who were watching their world end, creating an intensity of shared desperation that was psychologically overwhelming. Staff members who survived described the final weeks as a descent into surreal dysfunction. Normal military protocols were abandoned as the chain of command disintegrated. Officers who should have been coordinating defensive operations instead spent their time drinking and engaging in desperate liaisons with secretaries and nurses. Important strategic decisions were delayed or forgotten entirely as the people responsible for making them struggled with their own psychological collapse. The breakdown of communication systems meant that Hitler was often making decisions about military units that no longer existed, or giving orders to commanders who had already been killed or captured. Maps in the bunker showed German positions that had been overrun days earlier. Status reports detailed the strength of divisions that had ceased to exist. The entire planning process had become an exercise in managing phantom forces against phantom threats. April 22, 1945, marked the precise moment when delusion finally collapsed under the weight of mathematical reality. Hitler's admission that the war was lost wasn't just the end of Nazi Germany. It was the inevitable conclusion of what happens when leaders create systems where truth becomes whatever they decide it is, where competent advisors are dismissed for delivering uncomfortable facts, and where ideology is valued above evidence. The 1,000-year Reich died not in glorious battle, but in a damp concrete bunker with the quiet words of a broken man who had finally run out of people to blame for his own catastrophic failures.